AFIO Now is presented by Northwest Financial Advisors, where our world revolves around you.
Hello, everyone. This is Jim Hughes with AFIO Now. We are a program of recorded interviews with former senior U.S. intelligence officers and those who write about them. Today, I have a very talented guest. His name is Bruce Henderson. He served in the U.S. Navy during the Vietnam War, went back to college on the GI Bill, wrote for several major newspapers on the West Coast. He also taught writing at the School of Journalism at USC and Stanford. He is a prolific author with over 20 nonfiction works to his credit. His most recent New York Times bestseller is called Sons and Soldiers, which is the story of the Ritchie boys. In 2022, he published a book entitled Bridge to the Sun, which is the story of the secret role of Japanese American soldiers who fought in the Pacific during World War II. We did an AFIO Now interview with Bruce on that a couple of years ago, and it was a major hit. He's got a brand new book coming out entitled Midnight Flyboys. I just finished reading it. It is a great read, and I'm delighted to welcome Bruce back to talk about his new book.
Thank you, Jim.
Bruce, what was Operation Carpetbagger, and how large was it?
That was a top secret joint operation between OSS, their British counterparts, the SOE, and the U.S. Army Air Force. And the goal, the mission, was to strengthen resistance forces before and after D-Day. And they did so by parachuting munitions, supplies, and agents and spies behind enemy lines into the occupied countries of Western Europe. 90% of their efforts were in France, which is what I focus on in my book. And the rest, there were some flights into Belgium and Norway as well.
Bruce described the role of OSS in Operation Carpetbagger.
Well, OSS picked the targets for the Carpetbagger drops and sent agents as well as teams into France to work with the existing networks, all of which were set up by the British, by the SOEs, beginning as early as 1941. And in total, there were about 100 by the time we get to D-Day in June 44. The RAF was delivering British agents on smaller planes like the Lysander that could carry 2, maybe 3 at a time, but very few supplies. And by late 1943, Eisenhower decided he needed more than that prior to D-Day. He wanted a stronger resistance network to coordinate with the troops once they invaded the France. And so he committed the U.S. Army Air Force Air Wing, three squadrons of B-24s to this effort. And thus was born Operation Carpetbaggers. Those 3 squadrons represented about 48 operational aircraft at any given time. Originally had a complement of about 250 officers. Most of them were pilots, of course. About 1,500 enlisted men. They were the maintenance and administrative arm. And between January and September 44, more than 2,000 of these nighttime, we can talk a little bit more about these very unusual missions, were flown and delivered 10 million pounds of supplies by parachute and dropped more than 500 agents and special forces operators. There was a cost with this operation, of course. About 229 American airmen lost their lives. And if you look at the original 250, you would say, well, that's a 100% casualty rate. It was high. Of course, that included also some replacement crews as these planes went down. They lost 33 B-24s in total over this period of time.
Bruce, why was the B-24 Liberator chosen for the drop missions?
Yeah, that's a good question. The B-24 and its brother, if you will, the B-17, were doing a lot of all the heavy lifting in terms of the long-range bombing missions that the U.S. was flying, daylight bombing missions, I should say. But the reason the B-24 was picked for the carpetbagger missions is because their payload of about 12,000 pounds was twice that of the B-17, and they were faster and also had a longer range than the B-17s. As it happened, at the point that Eisenhower made this commitment, find me some squadrons that can do this, there were these three squadrons had just been relieved of anti-submarine patrols off of Spain, the Bay of Biscay, and they were experienced at these low-level anti-submarine flights, low-level over the ocean. And it was believed, given the nature of these carpetbagger missions, that they would be good for that. But the first briefing that they had for these pilots and air crews, they were really asked if they would volunteer for these missions. And anybody who didn't want to do it could get up and leave the room and be reassigned, and there would be no mark on their record. And I open with that scene in the book because I think it's remarkable that not a single person got up and left the room. Now, some of the crewmen were looking at their pilots to see, are they going to leave? And if they're going to leave, I'm probably going to go with my pilot. But nobody left the room.
What kind of supplies were delivered, and what all did it include?
Well, the supplies were, first of all, loaded into steel containers that could carry about 300 pounds worth. They were munitions, they were guns, there were even bicycle tires, for example. Anything that the resistance networks were radioing London and saying they were short of. And so they went into these dozen steel containers that were loaded into the bomb bays of the B-24s and were really dropped like bombs, only each of them had a parachute. And they had to go down to about 400 feet to drop the supplies and on target. And these targets that they were hitting for were really just dark fields out in the middle of nowhere that were lit by a few lights or even fires, and where the partisans were waiting to receive them. And so they had to be very low to get them accurately dropped. And then they were even dropping the agents out of the plane, and they usually carried 2 or 3 agents per mission. Not every mission, and they actually parachuted out of a hole in the bottom of the fuselage, and they went up to 600 feet for them to drop. And of course, anybody who's parachuting would know that there would be no time, and they weren't even carrying a reserve chute. That main chute either opened or they died. The planes flying at night, and that's why we called it midnight flyboys. They were flying at night for their own protection, and so as not to be spotted. The planes were painted black with very few markings, and they were solo missions. They went in low and as quietly as they could. They made their drops, and then they tried to hightail it back to England. The other problem with these missions for the pilots was that they had to slow that plane down from its normal cruising speed of about 220 miles an hour to 110 miles an hour to get those chutes to get out and open and not get tangled. And that was very close to the stalling speed of a B-24. And of course, when an aircraft, I don't care if it's a Piper Cub or a B-24, when it stalls, that means that it's slowed down so much and that there isn't enough airflow over the wings to keep it going. And the nose dips and they start heading down. The average time for a B-24 to recover from a stall, and this is certainly something that pilots practice all the time, it's about 1,500 feet. So if they stalled the aircraft at 600 feet, they were basically dead. They weren't going to have time to drop that nose, build up their speed, and get back into a flying position again. So it was very dangerous flying. And in the dark, very slow speeds, very low altitudes.
Bruce, who were the Joes and the Josephines? And what happened to them if they were captured?
Well, that was they were the code names of all of the agents, any of the agents who boarded the carpetbagger missions, because the crews did not know their real names, had no idea what they were going to do, who they were. So the male agents were called the Joes and the female agents were called the Josephines. And most of them, in fact, early on, I would say all of them were SOE trained British agents. Closer to D-Day and after D-Day, OSS trained agents were dropped as well. And in fact, some of the OSS units included the Jedburgh teams. They were 3-man multinational teams, usually a British officer, an American officer, and a French officer, or enlisted to handle the radio. One of those teams, of course, was led by a young Army major by the name of William Colby. The OSS also had operational groups, or OGs. These were larger, heavily armed as OSS teams, and they didn't go in until very close to D-Day, within a day or two, and certainly after D-Day. And they were in military uniforms. They weren't spies. They were military, and they were going in heavily armed to engage with the resistance forces, the German troops. And then there was an operation, also OSS operation, called Sussex. And they were OSS French volunteers who were dropped. And all of these were dropped by the carpetbaggers. And they were to provide intel as to what was going on the ground. So that's, as you can see, it was quite an operation.
Tell us about Josephine Nancy Wade.
Nancy Wake. Yeah, well, one thing I wanted to do in this book was not just simply have it be a story of pilots and aircraft. I wanted to know what happened to some of these folks, men and women, who jumped out of those planes in the middle of the night, deep behind enemy territories. And the fact that the carpetbaggers dropped something like 500 agents over that 9-month period, and about a dozen were women. And so one of the agents I followed was Nancy Wake. She was born in New Zealand, and as a young woman went to London, and where she took some journalism classes, got a job as a correspondent in Paris. This was now in the mid-30s. And as a journalist, she actually saw the Nazis in Vienna and saw the kind of atrocities they were committing already, burning Jewish stores, beating up Jews on the street. And this is where really her hatred for the Nazis developed. And so by the time that the Germans invaded France, she was married to a French businessman, industrialist. And she very early on began working with the resistance as a courier. And she was so successful that the Gestapo had a large bounty on her head. They didn't know her real name. They just called her the White Mouse. She flitted in and out and was known to be a tiny white woman. But beyond that, they couldn't identify her. Well, then things got very, very dangerous, and she had to leave. The Gestapo was coming over basically to get her. And so she got away. Her husband, who was a Frenchman, the plan was for him to follow in a couple of weeks. And so she made it out over the Pyrenees on an escape route that the partisans had set up. And she had actually helped set up that exact escape network, and got to England, where she waited for her husband to join her. And he never did. And she wouldn't know for a long while what his fate was. But she was recruited by the SOE because she had French fluency and she knew France. And she was very determined to do her part in the war. And so she went through the SOE training and ended up dropping out of a carpetbagger plane into France. So we follow her exploits, if you will. One of the resistance leaders who fought beside her said that Nancy was the most feminine woman I know until fighting starts, and then she's like 5 men. So she was really renowned for her for her skill and her abilities in that war against the Germans in the country that she loved.
Bruce, what happened to carpetbagger crews that were shot down over occupied France?
Well, many crews were lost when a plane was hit by enemy fire, whether it was the nighttime, the German night fighters, which were equipped with radar and could find a B-24, even painted all black, flying low and slow, or ground fire at times. And these planes, when a plane explodes and catches on fire, there are times when nobody gets out. There are other times when these pilots remained at the control to allow their crew to get out. And a number of pilots went down while their crewmen, 7 or 8 crewmen, were able to get out. The pilot wasn't. And of course, that was the ethos of the World War II bomber pilots. They were there to the last to make sure their crew got out. Once the airmen landed in occupied France, they tried to connect with the resistance, and some of them did, and actually made it out through on one of the escape routes back to England. And some of them, a little closer to D-Day, were hidden by the resistance until they were liberated by the Allied troops. And so it was a mix of experiences that these crews had, and I follow several of the crews to show what they went through.
Tell us about the exploits of Johnny Meade.
Yeah, Johnny Meade was bombardier on a carpetbagger plane that went down, and it was his job, because the carpetbagger planes weren't bombing, but he would help them find the drop zone and then would release the containers in the bomb bay over the target. So that was an important position. His plane, in fact, I follow his crew, the Simon crew, and they go down. They get hit and they're burning, and they go down, and the pilot, Murray Simon, stays with the plane, but he's also able to get out after all of his crew did. What's kind of interesting is you have 8 officers and enlisted all parachuting from the same plane, but none of them were caught up with anyone else. They all had a different experience, even though they were, of course, the wind blew them away from each other, and it was nighttime in the forest. Anyway, I follow them. Meade is very interesting because he meets up with a resistance group that is shorthanded, and they ask if he'll stay and help them organize from their side these nighttime drops. And he says, well, I'll be happy to, but we got to get a radio message to London, because otherwise it's my job to get out of here and get back to England. I'm supposed to do that. And so they send a radio message, and a week later, the message from London says you can keep him. So Johnny Meade ended up the only member of the carpetbaggers who officially was detached to join the resistance. And he ended up leading a group of 50 fighters in ambushes and firefights, and for which he ended up winning a Silver Star for gallantry in action. Quite a guy, quite a story.
How successful were the carpetbaggers?
Well, after France was liberated, Eisenhower estimated that the contribution of the French resistance was equal to 75,000 combatants. And in fact, after the war, he wrote in his own memoirs that in no previous war had resistance forces been so closely harnessed to the main military effort. They were in communications, they were in collaboration, and he believed, Eisenhower did, that the resistance forces ended up shortening the war by 6 months. So the fact that the resistance was greatly strengthened by these flights and these agents, and that they dropped into France, made the carpetbaggers a very successful operation.
What role did French resistance play both before and after D-Day?
Yeah, they had to be very careful before D-Day. In other words, when I say careful, they could set up networks, communications. They had to stash munitions and supplies. They importantly had to get radio communications with London going. But for their own self-defense, not engage in any large-scale attacks. because they could be wiped out. But after D-Day, they were assigned to hit specific targets, bridges that had to be blown to stop the German reinforcements from getting out to Normandy, communications lines, railroad lines. And that they were able to do because of the work that had been done in the months before D-Day.
So 80 years have passed. Why did it take so long for this story to be told?
That's one of the things that surprised me. Because of the OSS and SOE involvement, I think, largely, the carpetbagger pilots and crews were sent home after the war and told to forget everything. And that's a direct quote from one of these pilots I interviewed. Many of these guys went to their graves without their families even knowing what they did in the war. In the mid-1990s, the World War II files were declassified, even the OSS files largely. And they then really felt free for the first time to start talking about this. They went to reunions and talked to their buddies about what they did. A Carpetbaggers Association website was established by a couple of sons of pilots, and it had extensive history, which I gained access to: flight records, squadron histories, all the dates, names, and various interviews. At the time that I started interviewing the book, there were only 3 carpetbaggers still alive. And at last count, those guys are still going at age 100. One of them, tail gunner Bill Becker, 99 years old, was determined to make it back to Normandy last year for the 80th reunion of D-Day. And for about 6 months, he had a suitcase in the living room of his apartment, reminding him that he had to keep going and stay alive that long to get back to the D-Day ceremonies. And he made it on one of those flights that they did for the veterans. And when he stepped off the plane on the French soil, he said, "I made it." And there was a New York Times reporter there who heard that. And that was the New York Times quote of the day on the front page with its coverage of the anniversary festivities. Bill Becker made it. So I'm really delighted that I was able to tell this story, long overdue. And it really felt important.
Bruce, how were the air crews recognized after the war?
Well, the units themselves, the 3 squadrons, were awarded the Distinguished Unit Citation for extraordinary heroism. Francia honored them for, quote, dash, courage and spirit of sacrifice. In 2018, the Carpetbaggers, along with the OSS folks, received the Congressional Gold Medal, as you know, the highest civilian honor given by Congress, for arming and training the intelligence networks and resistance operations.
Well, the name of the book is Midnight Flyboys. It is a terrific read. I recommend it to all. And I want to thank Bruce Henderson for a fantastic description.
Thank you, Jim.
AFIO is a small, nonprofit, apolitical, educational organization whose main mission is to help prepare the next generation of intelligence officers to confront the challenges our nation faces in the years ahead. To learn more or support our outreach programs, visit www.afio.com.